welcome everyone to this episode of Author Talk. My name is Aaron, and today we have an outstanding guest that I'm personally looking forward to learning from, and I know that a lot of other coaches and professionals will benefit from as well. We have G. Gregory Half, who is the professor of strength and conditioning and the course coordinator for the postgraduate degree, in strength and conditioning at Edith Cowan University in Australia. He has published more than 240 articles and has focused his research on performance effects in the areas of strength training methodologies, performance testing, training theory, nutritional supplementations, a whole host of topics there. He has previously been president of the National Strength and Conditioning Association and a senior associate editor for the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. He's also a national level weightlifting coach in the United States and Australia. And serves as a consultant for various sports bodies like the Australian Football League, Rugby Union, National Football League. I mentioned all of that to give perspective on what we are about to get into today and his knowledge of everything that we're going to talk about today. So he's bringing an extraordinary wealth of knowledge to us, and more specifically today to talk to us about periodization in his book, Scientific Foundations and Practical Applications of Periodization. So again, that was a lot to fit in there, but I did want to give everyone perspective on your knowledge and background to kind of see where you're coming from here today. So did I leave anything out there?
No, I probably do way too much and probably spend too little time at home. But right. Yeah, I think my journey's been really interesting because I've done a lot of different things, and it gives me a little bit of a different perspective of sports performance and sports science. So I think that's important.
Yep, definitely. So, and like I said, I gave, I guess, relatively speaking, a more recent background of kind of what you've been through. And, but I'm curious, what is it about this particular field that interested you in getting started in the first place? To the extent of, I mean, you've obviously built a very accomplished career, but what kind of got you into this field?
That's a really good question. So my dad's a Marine, and so at the age of 8, he started training me to be a Marine. I'm very used to getting up at 5 a.m. to work out and train because that's what Dad made us do. So I was always in sport. I actually was really interested in computer programming. And when I went to college, a professor named Frank Pulo at East Stroudsburg University saw me working out in the weight room, and he's like, "You need to come to my class." And I'm like, "But I'm just a freshman." He's like, "It doesn't matter. You need to come to my class." And so I enrolled in a higher level class, and he handed me a copy of Husker Power and the original 1987 incarnation of the NSCA. And he's like, "This is where you belong." And so it's been kind of that journey. When I was a track athlete in college, and York Barbell Talent ID'd me for weightlifting. And through weightlifting, I met Andy Fry before he was Professor Andy Fry. And he introduced me to Mike Stone, Bill Kramer, Kyle Pierce, John Gardhammer. And they all kind of aimed me in a direction, I guess. It's about the people you meet, I think, more than anything that gets you where you're going. And Mike Stone probably inspired me the most. And then more recently, K.O. Hakkinen, who's become a really good friend of mine, has been a really big mentor to me in the last maybe 10 to 12 years.
I guess in terms of that, what were you able to learn from those individuals specifically that kind of made you realize, like, hey, this is something that I want to learn more about and continue to study for the rest of my career?
Well, I think for me, it's, I mean, I remember when I first met Mike Stone when I was a grad student. He sat me in his office. He's like, "Why are you here?" And most people in his grad office would say something like, "Oh, I want a better job. I want to make more money." And I was just like, "Dude, I just want to be the strongest dude I can be." And they tell me that you can teach me how to do that. And so we've worked together now since 1993. So that's, 31 years or something like that. It's been a long journey, but I think for me, it's always been a quest to figure out how to be stronger for myself and the athletes that I work with. So yeah, really kind of passionate about trying to figure out, how to train better. And I think that's something that's really interesting to me. And I think it's something that's evolving all the time.
And that obviously leads into the very specific discussion that we're going to talk about today, and learning how to get stronger, how to train better. Now, we're obviously talking about periodization. before we get too much further into the conversation, I think it's important to kind of define what periodization is. Having worked in the field, I obviously understand what it means to a degree, but you bring up an interesting point in the book that there might be some confusion on the exact definition there.
Yeah, I think there is. The reason I say that is because when we look at a lot of the research that's done that's called periodization research, it's really programming.
Okay.
And people are just manipulating programming variables and not thinking about how training is integrated and how it's sequenced and how the global factors that underpin training work together to get the athlete where they need to be. So for me, it's really a macro management strategy of the training process. And so, I need to know where I'm trying to get to. And then the programming strategies are the actual, how I'm going to do it. And so periodization kind of gives me the blueprint or the scaffold of where I'm trying to go and what I think I'm going to do. And obviously monitoring is going to guide the programming strategies underneath that. And I think too many people get tied up in the sets and reps as that's periodization. I'm just varying sets and reps. But in reality, it's really having a more holistic plan and working with the athlete in multiple dimensions. And that could include nutrition, that could include psychological training, that could include motor learning and things of that nature could fold into that.
Okay, so I guess more specifically there, I completely agree, because when I started learning, I mean, we talked about periodization, obviously, and then it was almost immediately like, how many sets and reps should you do for this particular goal? So I guess, how would you break that down from your studies then, and from your all the research that you've obviously done, into exactly how to manage that plan?
Well, I think you got to start with what you're training for, and I think we got to set some timelines. And in a lot of ways, we can look at it from a long-term athlete development model. And more recently, we've been looking at this idea that periodization is a framework for deliberate practice. Okay. So we're actually guiding this process of developing some sort of skills and technical abilities, but also that could include physical things as well: strength, endurance, power, etc. So, for example, in an annual training plan, if I'm working with college football, I know when the football season is.
Right.
And I'm going to work backwards from the football season. I'm going to figure out, some timelines. Where are the periods where the NCAA restricts my ability to work with athletes? Where are exam periods? Where are opportunities where I have more time with the athletes? Like, for example, during certain parts of the year, we get 20 hours per week versus 8. Okay. And then I can lay a framework of, okay, I know this is where things are important. We know from some of Brian Mann's work that during exam periods, athletes are more apt to get sick. So we've got to plan on unloading or deloading during that time frame so that we can account for that psychological stress. So I think that's what we do with the periodization. We set the strategies, but then we've got to use like benchmarking and programming strategies to align with those time courses. Like, the strategies I'm going to use in season are very different than the strategies I'm going to use off season, where I'm trying to build a foundation. Sports like, for example, American football is real easy, because in reality, you have a competition every weekend, and it's probably a pretty good framework. You get into basketball, it gets a lot more tricky with, up to 3 competitions a week and copious amounts of travel, and you've got to kind of manage the training stressors. And I think that's where those programming and monitoring nexus comes in, where the monitoring informs the programming, but we still know where the competitive season is. So we know where we're trying to compete, and that's our framework. And periodization gives us those timelines, but also we can look at the strategies we want to align with those time points as well. And I think you put all that together, it kind of guides your process.
Okay, you touched on a number of things there. A couple of those things I want to get to in a little bit, but first, for someone maybe that is only beginning to learn about periodization, and maybe kind of earlier in their career, and just kind of learning what it means to periodize and train athletes, can you kind of break down the structure for them in terms of, we have, macro cycles, mesocycles, microcycles. I think a lot of people have probably heard about those, but aren't exactly clear what that means.
Well, I think it gets a little bit confusing too, because it depends on what school of thought you come from. So if you come through the German school of thought, there is no mesocycle. If you come through the Russian school of thought, there is, in fact, a mesocycle. I remember when I co-authored with Tudor Bompa his 5th edition of his book, we had great debates on that because he came from the German school of thought and I came more from the Russian school of thought. And so we had to come to some sort of compromise there. So if we look at the annual training plan, so if you think about a year of training, it could be broken into one macro cycle if you have one competitive season. So, you know, your typical American football, you could think of it as one, well, let's use professional football. Professional football has one macro cycle because they're competing just to one season. If you have multiple seasons, you could have multiple macro cycles. A great example that I like to use is high school sports in the United States. I may play football in the fall, I may play basketball in the winter, and I may do track and field in the spring. So that would be three macro cycles. And macro cycles contain preparation, competition, and potentially a transition to link between macro cycles. Transition is an underload or kind of like a recovery period of time. Now, we could then go to mesocycles, which are probably most commonly known in modern taxonomy as blocks of training. And they're about 2 to 6 weeks of training. And they have some sort of focus that we can build on. So like we have one block might be hypertrophy, the next block may be strength, the next block may have a focus of speed strength or strength speed. And we can link them. And then underneath that, we're looking at, you know, our weekly structures on average is 7 days, but it doesn't have to be. It could be a few days to 2 weeks, or microcycles. So you can think of it as large to small, with the smallest being the actual training day and the training units within the training day or training sessions. So for me, it's just a planning structure of how to organize things to make it so that we can accomplish the tasks we need.
Something that you brought up there is interesting. You mentioned the kind of like more of the, I guess, high school training cycle. Of course, when you get to the professional level and maybe even the collegiate level, athletes generally have one sport that they're training for year round, whereas you mentioned more along the lines of multi-sport athletes that might be playing multiple sports. You laid that out a little bit, but can you go into a little more detail? Like if someone is struggling to program and or periodize or work through their periodization, trying to think of my words here. How would you approach that in terms of, you know, training for multiple sports at the same time?
Well, hopefully they're doing sports that are compatible, and that's the first thing. You know, if you're doing cross country running and then trying to do football, it's not going to work. You want to have some compatibility. So in reality, it can actually link nicely. When I was a high school athlete, we played football. So we trained for football. All our training from like June or July all the way through December was football specific. Strength training was centered on getting ready to play football. Then we did indoor track and field because I lived on the East Coast. So all our strength training all shifted towards, I was a sprinter and a thrower, shifted towards sprinting and throwing. Because I was pretty good at that, I stayed in that for the spring. So all that training went there, and we just went through rotation. So you can almost think of it as individual seasons. So I'm going to train for the season of football, the season of indoor track and field for me, and then outdoor track and field. Now you have to prioritize which is probably your most important sport. You know, most high school males, it's going to be probably football, but it could be very well athletics in my example. Now, my wife, who's an amazing athlete, probably far better than I ever will be, and a better coach than I ever will be. She did multiple sports as well. She did throwing and volleyball and basketball, so she was able to do all three of them. And so I think we innately as coaches know it, but we don't think about how things sequence and how we transition. We just kind of play. I think we can be more organized so that we can build motor literacy and competency in our training. I think we're seeing a lot of it now. I can speak to Australia at the moment. Our athletes coming up are not as well prepared as they were 10 years ago. Is my notice. I mean, even in our sports science program, they come in and it's like they've not been in a weight room before and they're freshmen. Wow. And it's really quite disturbing. So the structure has to change. I can't train them the same way I did athletes 10 years ago because they don't have the motor literacy. So I think we have to kind of think about that bigger picture as well.
Okay. Something I want to touch on too, because you mentioned periodization as a whole. I think of when a lot of people think of periodization initially, they think of, strength training or athletic training, sports performance. but you do get into in the book, periodization for nutrition and for recovery and that type of thing. So can you touch on some of those aspects as well?
Yeah, I think that's an important one, because I think there's some review papers that have been written by some authors that suggest that periodization is just all about strength training. And I look at that as a very simplistic view of what periodization is. So when we look at the holistic development of an athlete, nutrition becomes important. So like I coach weightlifting, and I do that a lot. I really believe to be a good sports scientist, you have to still coach. And that was instilled upon me by Mike Stone.
Okay.
So I still coach about 20 hours a week on top of my academic role.
Busy person.
It's not easy, but it's where I get ideas, and it's where we test out things, and we have to keep our skills up. But when we look at that, my sport, we have to be in weight classes, so we have to think about dietary interventions to maintain that athlete's weight class. For example, there's some wonderful work by Louise Burke, who used to be at the Australian Institute of Sport, that looks at when do we carbohydrate reduce or restrict? So on a non-training day, we don't need as much carbohydrates. So we could reduce the carbohydrate intake because we're not needing it as much. On a hard training day, we need more carbohydrates. So we could match the fueling strategies to the energetic demands of the training sessions. We could also look at recovery strategies in nutrition. When do we eat? How do we space out? How much protein do we need? If we get injured, we might need more protein. There was a wonderful paper written by Abby Smith-Ryan that I absolutely found fascinating. In fact, it's found its way into the book about how to nutrition time for recovery from injury. And that's really important when we're dealing with athletes, because that's something that's probably going to happen. It's a fantasia to think we'll never have an injury. So I think that's important. And then the work that we did, my doctoral student, Barry Horgan, in conjunction with Shauna Halson and Dale Chapman and Eric Drinkwater and Nick West, we did some wonderful work at the AIS looking at recovery strategies.
Okay.
And for example, different water immersion protocols. So there's some evidence that people suggest that cold water immersion reduces or blunts the adaptations to strength training. So if you want to be conservative, in the preparation phase, you might not do any cold water immersion because adaptation is what you want. Okay. But in season, rapid recovery is what you want, so that you get back to competition. So you're not as worried about adaptation. You're just worried about restoration. So you could plan different strategies. You could look at compression garments while you sleep to speed recovery during the in-season period after a game so it's about those things. Those are all layered in. Meal frequency. You could also look at mindfulness training and dealing with anxiety and things of that nature, and where you place that in the training of the week.
I think all of those aspects are so interesting because like I mentioned, like on the surface, many trainers and many coaches look at what we do as, straight athletic performance or strength training. And I think for the athletes, a lot of that other stuff kind of falls by the wayside, and we don't think as much about nutrition as we probably should. We don't think as much about recovery. And maybe that's, kind of a mindset of the athlete or the particular coach, and just wanting to, go full force all the time and not, I guess this is where the periodization comes in, where you do have to kind of, monitor, like you said, what the athlete is going through. So,
well, because the monitoring process is the most important thing, because you could have your periodized phases and periods laid out for the year, but the athlete may be progressing at a slower or faster rate from the programming strategy. So then you have to adapt your programming strategies to either speed the adaptations up or slow them down, depending on where you are in your progression. I think that's the important thing. I think a lot of people get locked into this idea that periodization is like Moses with the tablets coming down. It really isn't. Periodization is the framework. Programming is where all the plasticity is, where you make the changes to adapt to the athlete's changing status. And I think that's really one of the things that I think people forget. And if you coach, you know this, but sometimes in the theoretical world, they get really kind of dogmatic.
Yeah, no, I think those are excellent points, and something that hopefully everyone listening right now, everyone that will listen later on, can kind of take into account that, that is really the most important part in getting the best results and doing the best for your athletes. So now something that you mentioned that I kind of want to get into, when we were kind of having our back and forth, leading up to today, is a trend or a thought process that might suggest that periodization no longer works,
Yeah.
or there's no longer a purpose for using
Yeah.
periodization. I guess in my own training philosophy, I don't necessarily subscribe to that. I mean, I'm obviously more on the lines of what you're saying here. But what have you heard in that respect, and where do you think that is coming from?
Oh, I think I've heard it all.
Yeah.
Like, there's a wonderful
Right.
paper that Verkhoshansky wrote a paper back in the 80s that said periodization was dead. So this is not a new concept.
Yeah.
He was very believing in the idea of programming was the main driver, which I totally agree with. I think programming is the main driver of adaptation, but I have to also know where I'm trying to get to and where I'm trying to be. So I always look at it as a continuum, that you can have very loose periodization where you just have training sessions planned, to very stringent periodization where you have nutrition, recovery, all those things planned. So I think there's a lot of people that are just kind of in this mindset that you can keep the athlete at a high level of performance all the time. We see this a lot with some of the velocity-based training research at the moment. They're just like, train on velocity. It doesn't matter the reps that you use. It's all going to be fine. If you're just 10% reduction in velocity, it's going to be spectacular. The body doesn't work that way. The body doesn't respond that way, and the human psychology doesn't respond that way. You have times when you're good and times when you're bad. Sometimes you have to compete when you're bad. You're never going to always be optimal. So you have to kind of look at this as a process of training. And I think people have disconnected periodization and programming and kind of suggested they're the same exact thing, when in fact one is a framework that informs another. So the periodization, I know when my season is, I know when I want to try to increase my chances of being successful or optimal. So I'm training for the football season, let's say, and the programming is how I'm going to manipulate it. So I think some people are really stuck on the programming. But if I'm always programming in a certain way, how do I know where I'm going to be? And we know that there's some sequentialness to training. For example, we know if we increase muscle mass and then we follow it with strength and we capitalize on the delayed training effects, we get enhancements in performance. And you can hold those enhancements or peak performances for short windows of time. You can't say, oh, my football season starts in August and I'm going to go all the way to February and be at the highest level of my performance every Saturday. It doesn't work that way. Smart college football teams plan, non-conference games where they can pound on somebody and be tired. And that's so that they can reload the athlete with training and recover them for the more important competitions. So for me, where I actually have very heated debates with my students because they come in the graduate program and they try to argue that periodization is no longer fit for purpose. And it's a really interesting debate. And I always ask them, I say, well, when are you training? And they're like, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Okay. When's your competition? And by the end of the conversation, we're like, you have a structure, you have a framework. And so you have a form of periodization. If you think of it as a scaffold that you hang your programming decisions off of, there is no alternative to periodization. I asked Dr. John Kiley this at the UKSCA. He's written a wonderful paper on, the fallacy of periodization. And I'm like, well, me and Professor Stone were like, well, what's the alternative? No one can give us an alternative. And there's no researcher that has questioned periodization has offered a viable alternative other than progressive overload, which is a very rudimentary form of periodization.
So do you think in that respect, it's just kind of a misconception of what periodization is? And maybe I don't want to say that they're necessarily trying to be contrarian, but just the idea that they're not thinking of it, I guess, in the same respect of what someone like yourself is. It maybe just kind of a misconception of what periodization is.
I think there is a misconception, but I also think one of the things that I probably would say that was one of the best things for me is that when I studied with Professor Stone, I was an athlete that he coached. I was a student in his class. He forced me to coach with his wife. And we did research together. And so at every level, I got to see things from different perspectives. So as the athlete, I was experienced a taper and sequential periodization modeling up close and personal and felt when things were appropriate. As a coach, I learned to write it and do it under his wife's tutelage. And then as a researcher in the labs, we did experimentation. And then in the classroom, we learned the whys.
Right.
And I think a lot of people aren't getting those experiences anymore. He's a unique mentor in the sense that, and I try to model myself after him as much as I can in this regard. He makes you see things from different perspectives because he wants you to be able to work in all disciplinaries. Like when I arrived at App State, he's like, you will compete in weightlifting and there is no choice or you don't stay here.
Okay.
Right. He was that definitive about it. He's like, you will coach or you won't stay in this program on scholarship. And so I felt as if at the time, you're like, man, this guy's mean. But in hindsight, it was probably the best learning experiences because understanding the whys, learning how to do, and then experiencing gives you a very different perspective. So I think some people that question periodization haven't actually had good training processes that they've gone through where it's been done well by someone who has got the master skills. I know Jimmy Radcliffe has some similar philosophies to Mike Stone. We've talked about it as far as coaches need to train and they need to coach and do those things.
Okay.
So I think that's part of it. But I also think in academia, the ivory tower, there's often this very strict adherence to these rules that don't always apply to sport because it's very hard to do research with very elite athletes in a very strict scientific way because you can't control everything in their lives or you're going to shorten their career potentially.
Sure.
And so we leverage different ways of looking at things. So I think some scientists that are very dogmatic to the scientific principles and it's only this way, who haven't been in a true sports science background or under true sports scientists, get a little bit confused by the processes. That's my own opinion. I mean, I don't mean to insult anybody with that, but I think there's a different approach for applied sports science research than basic science. There has to be.
And I think that's why you have such a great perspective as a whole, because you're coming at it from all angles. Like you said, when you were coming up, you were able to experience all different perspectives, and that's my opinion. That's why you have the knowledge that you do now, and that's why you're so good at what you do. So, yeah.
I'm also blessed to have a wife who's a strength coach who tells me when my science is not great.
So you're saying she kind of keeps you in line a little bit too.
Yeah, she's definitely someone who reminds me that what works in the lab sometimes doesn't work in the gym.
Fair enough. So I do want to be respectful of your time, and I really want to thank you for your time today. This has been an awesome conversation and one that I know I learned from. I know that everyone listening to this has learned from. If you are a professor, a coach, or a trainer, please do yourself a favor and pick up a copy. This is an excellent resource. I know in our discussion just now, we've only scratched the surface of what's detailed in this book here. Greg goes into, like I mentioned, not only the discussion of periodization theory, but he gets into, how and why you should periodize your training, even more in depth than what we just talked about. You'll find much more on fatigue and recovery, periodizing, struggling with that word this morning, your nutrition. Again, when I saw this one come across, I honestly immediately ordered my own copy because I knew how much that I would benefit from it, and just the detail that was put into this text is pretty amazing. It's a resource that I think every coach or trainer should have. So with that, I will give you the last word here again, and maybe let everyone kind of know where they can keep up with all the great work that you're doing.
Oh, I think for me, I think one of the things I always tell people, I like working with defense people, and one of their sayings that I love is that we don't rise to the occasion, we fall to the level of our preparation. And I look at periodization as that way, as we're trying to give athletes the preparation they need so that they can be successful. Where people can find me, I'm on Instagram at Doc Hoff. I'm on Twitter at Doc Hoff. I don't do the Facebook thing very much. Okay. That's more for family. just because I live on the other side of the world and you don't get to see your family very much. So I kind of
True.
keep that just for family stuff. Probably should start a separate one for this kind of stuff. I am always at NSCA. I'll be there this year. It's something I take great pride in, being at the NSCA conference every year. I've been going since 1995 and only missed 1 year because we couldn't leave Australia. So I did it virtually. So I was there, but I wasn't. I definitely will be at the HK booth a lot. I like to go and hang out with Roger Earl, who all this stuff wouldn't happen without Roger. He's the one who talked me into putting all this to paper. And big shout out to Roger for all the support over the last 15 years of the things that I do. And he's really been a good friend and a good editor for me to just keep me on track and stuff. But I also show up in England from time to time. I'm hoping to be at Paul Comfort's conference this year in June. Just got to finalize a few things. But yeah, those are great things, places to see me. I definitely love talking to people about training, and it's my favorite thing. I could talk about periodization every day. I actually teach an entire course on it for an entire semester. So it's definitely something that is evolving, and even now things are changing, and our ideas are growing, and there's a lot more that's going to come in the future that I think will be interesting. We touch on some of it in the book, but I think things have evolved since even the book coming out now, with some of the AI and machine learning stuff that's coming down the pike that will influence monitoring, I think. But now there's a lot coming. But yeah, I'm out there, and I always answer emails if people email me at work. At my work email, I tend to answer emails pretty quickly if you have questions.
Awesome. So everyone listening, maybe you'll catch Greg at a conference. Definitely pick up a copy of the book. Again, Scientific Foundations and Practical Applications to Periodization. Again, we only scratched the surface here, and like I mentioned in one of our emailing back and forth, we could probably talk about this for hours. But I definitely appreciate your time, and I'll be talking to you soon.
Yeah, I hope so.